Was Phoebe an official deaconess? Throughout history, people have sometimes accepted assumptions without testing them. Consider the story of King Charles II, who once presented a challenge to the Royal Society. He claimed that if two identical buckets of water were placed on a scale and fish were added to one, the weight would remain the same. Many intellectuals scrambled to explain why this might be the case, until one skeptical thinker simply asked, "Is that even true?" And, of course, it wasn't. The bucket with the fish weighed more, just as physics dictated. This principle applies to biblical interpretation as well. Before we assume that Phoebe was an official deaconess, we must first ask, is that even true? Let's examine the evidence. Paul introduces Phoebe in Romans 16, verses 1 to 2. "I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant of the church, which is at Cenchrea, that ye receive her in the Lord, as becometh saints, and that ye assist her in whatsoever business she hath need of you, for she hath been a succourer of many, and of myself also." The Greek word translated as servant here is diakonos, which can mean servant or minister. Sometimes it is translated as deacon when referring to the formal office of a deacon, as in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 to 13. The question is whether Phoebe's title indicates she held an official church position, or if it simply describes her as a faithful servant of the church. If we assume that diakonos always refers to an official deacon, we would run into several absurd conclusions. For example, all Christians would be official deacons, as stated in Matthew 20, verse 26, and John 12, verse 26. Secular servants and government officials would be church deacons, as mentioned in Romans 13, verse 4. Even Jesus himself would be an official deacon of sin, according to Galatians 2, verse 17. Clearly, diakonos does not always mean an appointed deacon. Context determines whether the word refers to the specific office or to general service. Was Phoebe an official deacon? Some argue that because Paul calls Phoebe both a sister and a servant, he must be implying an official role. However, Paul frequently uses similar language for other Christians without implying they held an office. For instance, he refers to Tychicus as a beloved brother and faithful minister, diakonos, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 21. Epaphras as our dear fellow servant, a faithful minister, diakonos, of Christ in Colossians chapter 1, verse 7. If Phoebe's mention of diakonos makes her an official deacon, then Tychicus and Epaphras would also need to be classified as such, which is unlikely given their roles as traveling evangelists. Another argument comes from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11, which states, "Even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things." Some suggest that since this verse appears in the middle of Paul's qualifications for deacons, it may refer to female deacons rather than deacons' wives. However, the Greek word translated wives, gun, is the same word used throughout the New Testament for married women. If Paul had intended to establish the role of female deacons, he could have used a more specific term to avoid confusion. Historical and practical considerations. Some point to early church history as evidence for official deaconesses. A letter from Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor in the early 2nd century, mentions torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. However, this letter does not confirm that the early church had a formal office of deaconess, only that some women were referred to as servants. Even if history did record such a development, this would not necessarily mean it was biblical. Many unbiblical traditions crept into early Christianity, including hierarchical leadership structures and unscriptural practices. The true measure of doctrine is not historical prevalence, but scriptural authority. The role of women in the church. Scripture makes it clear that women played a significant role in the early church. They were vital servants, teachers of other women and children, and workers in evangelism. However, the office of deacon, as described in 1 Timothy chapter 3, is tied to specific qualifications that require one to be the husband of one wife. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, ruling his household well. This qualification alone excludes women from the role. This does not diminish the value of women in the church. Rather, it affirms that God designed different roles for men and women in service to him, Just as men are not called to give birth, women are not called to certain leadership roles in the church. Instead of questioning God's design, we should celebrate the unique and valuable roles He has given to all His children. Conclusion. The idea that Phoebe was an official deaconess does not hold up under scrutiny. The term diakonos does not automatically imply a formal office, and there is no clear biblical command or precedent for appointing female deacons. While women like Phoebe served the church faithfully and were highly regarded, their service did not constitute an official office. God has given men and women unique and complementary roles in His church. Instead of striving for positions of authority that Scripture does not authorize, all Christians, men and women alike, should seek to serve God wholeheartedly in the roles He has designed for them. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 18, "But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased Him."